are going to be doing a program on why your vote matters. So many people think that it doesn't. We thought that we really need to talk about why voting matters and why we all need to go out there and do it. So we have a pretty interactive program today, which means audience participation, and that's going to be the first part of our program.
So this, the league is both partisan, is political but nonpartisan. And some of our programs are in support of positions that we have taken after extensive study, where we look at the issues around criminal justice in childhood or criminal justice for adults, or we look at the natural gas terminal that they were going to put in Long Beach. That was a big study we did years ago. Other activities like that. Today is more around education, which is the other arm of the league, where we want people to feel as though they have everything they need in order to be an informed voter. One of the things that we are looking at is the horrific rate of voting, particularly among young people. But that's not the only group that isn't voting. I have a niece and a nephew back east, and they call and say, what's your opinion on this, and who are you voting for on here? And then I follow up with them afterwards and say, did you vote? And they said, no. So there's a lot of people who are not voting, and we have anecdotal evidence and a little bit of research, but some anecdotal evidence that says it's around, I don't feel heard anyway. My vote doesn't count. There's millions of people voting. How could my vote count? But what it comes down to is, I don't feel like I'm going to be heard. I don't feel like I am heard in the current conversation. So we want to start off today's program on why your vote is so important. We want to start off with the issue of, can you show the next slide? We want to start off with the issue of not being heard and what that is all about. So we said this is, I heard somebody say that they were just an observer. There are no observers in this meeting. Everybody participates in this. I want you to turn to someone who is sitting near you. And in twos or threes, there are 3 topics we want you to discuss. Do all of them, do one of them, it doesn't matter. What we want to do is have a group discussion afterwards about what you think about, what does it feel like if you have experienced not being heard. So the 3 questions are, describe a time when your voice wasn't heard. Okay? We've all had that experience of, I'm here and somebody else is here and we're just not communicating. How does that feel, and did you take any action, and if so, what was the action you took in that conversation? What were the consequences of not being heard to you and to the other person? And what are some of the ways that others silence your voice? I had an experience recently talking about sexual assault with a man who is very empathetic. His daughter was sexually assaulted not too long ago. His way of dealing with it is to be all up in his head about taking accountability for our behavior and intellectualizing the whole thing. And I was standing there in tears talking about my personal experience of having been sexually assaulted. We were like ships in the night. And the consequences are, he has a daughter that he's trying to help. And I finally got through to him and said, this is not an intellectual exercise for your daughter. She experienced it. It is only an emotional experience. It is not an intellectual exercise. And he burst into tears and we were able to have a conversation. So the consequences, if we hadn't gotten to that point, would be that he would be unable to help his 19-year-old daughter. Those are big consequences. Have you experienced that I've got chills. Have you experienced any of that firsthand? And if it has happened, and it doesn't have to be a big issue like sexual assault, it can be you didn't do the dishes. But what are the consequences for not being heard? What happens to a relationship when you're in those conversations and you're not being heard? You got 10 minutes, it's 10 after. At 20 after, we will stop and have you, we'll have a large conversation about what you've come up with. What were some of the situations that came up?
HOA.
HOA.
I mean, everybody can understand that one.
Anyone who's ever participated in one can. So what was the experience?
Well, we're re-roofing the building that we live in. There's 57 units in the condos where I am. And the HOA did not inform people about their television aerials and their antennas and dishes and so forth appropriately. And consequently, when asked to please do that, you got several different answers, and unfortunately, right now, everybody is without any TV whatsoever. And a special aerial, or they do it on their computer, and we have no idea. We're told by one person that it's going to be back. We can use it in 3 days. We can start setting up our rooms in 3 days. Others say 3 weeks. So, you know, the communication has just felt void for, you know, the people who are living in those 57 units, so.
Certainly not heard, yeah.
And inappropriate, absolutely.
Yeah, so YouTube goes down and the United States goes crazy. So you can just imagine. So another story about not being heard. Lisa?
Well, I had I started a new job, and right from the get-go, I was struggling. It's a pretty overwhelming job, and they don't give you any training, and so I just was gung-ho, working 11 hours a day, but I wasn't really getting the results that they expected. And my boss, every time I talked to him, every time he called me, it was negative. He would start out with negative, what I was doing wrong, and he was pretty strong about it. And even though I was telling him, I'm struggling, I need help, can you help me? He really wasn't listening, obviously, because he wasn't helping. He put together a little meeting. It was a one-way, again, not listening to what I needed. And to the point last Friday where I raised my voice, where was one particular item he was asking I knew was not correct. I would never do that. And I raised my voice and said, what do you expect me to do? And when he came back with the expected, it was completely something I would not do. And I said, no, with all due respect, I would never do that. And it was very stern in my voice. It took him about 30 minutes after the phone call, and he called back to apologize and said, I realize that our relationship has gotten off on a bad start, and it's very stressful. I was very stressed. And I said, yep, I'll say that. And call yesterday, completely different tune, and he started out with a positive and ended with a positive, which is how we're trained to do. So I didn't get heard, and as a result, I wasn't able to do the job well for 3 months. Not getting heard for 3 months meant I didn't do probably to my potential, because I was so stressed. Every time he would call, I'd have an anxiety attack, which means I would shut down and I wouldn't do what I needed to do. So it was completely unproductive, and that's the consequence of it.
And not only are you suffering, but the company is not getting what they need as well.
Right.
And the person who's doing that is not getting feedback that his leadership style is inappropriate, so he's probably doing it to other people as well.
Well, I know another girl who he made
So-
cry.
Yeah, so
I
the
wanted- yeah.
consequences ripple out. We don't even think about that. What was your story?
Oh, my name is Alice. I have a grandson who'll be 5 next month. And a couple of weeks ago, my angel of my life. A couple of weeks ago, I was at his house and his mother told him to do something. And I think she thought he was not listening to her. But in a 4-year-old's mind, I'm gonna finish this and then I'll get to what you told me to do. And so she raised her voice at him, and he sits down and he starts crying. And I went, what are you crying about? And he says, nobody listens to me. And it made me think about what you said about your niece and nephew, nobody will hear me. So we don't realize that not being heard starts at this level. And until somebody actually breaks that cycle, we don't believe we're being heard.
Yeah. I was thinking about, my son came home with a report card. My ex-husband was there that day, and he walked in and he was really proud, and he showed us the report card, and it was 5 A's and a B. And his father said, what happened here? And my son, he was 14, I don't know where he learned this. He turned on his heel and he went upstairs. He didn't say a word. And about 10 minutes later, he came downstairs, and I had explained to his dad what he did. And my son came downstairs and he walks up to his dad and he said, always, you focus on what I don't do well, and I'm sick of it. And I thought, holy cow. But his dad was prepared to say, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, and the the thing that gives me chills is that my experience is that after those struggles, the relationship gets tighter.
Yes.
Yeah.
The relationship gets so much better. Now, I don't know if it's gonna work with me, or even with the boss, but certainly personally, my experience is that relationships get better after those kinds of experiences. Any more? Anybody wanna share one?
You know, we had a big group, so, there was all kinds of different things, but I think what was interesting was how people reacted to it. We had one person say they just ignore it. Another person, they try to work out a different ways of trying to be heard, and then, get angry. So, there's different responses to it, and when you started this, you were talking about people not voting, and, the first person that said, I just ignore it, I just kind of shut down, and that's kind of where I think that was just immediate, like, oh wow, that's exactly what it is.
That's exactly right. And these things, to me, are very much connected. Phyllis?
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to share this, but I worked for an insurance company that had a home office in the south, and I was there for a while. And we were having a management meeting, and I noticed consistently, whenever I brought something up, it was ignored until a man brought the same subject up, and then it was okay.
Very common.
But validated by a man expressing the same opinion.
And Kim, you made a comment very similar to what our friend here just said about your reaction when you're not heard.
Oh, yeah, so I gave the example of, when my husband and I first got married and we had our first fight, and it was just like, he was coming from here and I'm from here, and neither one of us could get our arms around, what the other person was really trying to say. So he would just raise his voice louder, and I guess he was trying to make himself understood by being loud, and then I would
Right.
cry. Eventually we got some outside help and learned how to read the signals that each of us was giving each other. And now we're at a point, we recognize these patterns when we start to fight that we fall into, and we're like, yeah, we're doing it again, okay, then we just, we're done,
So, we've talked a little bit about the consequences. What are some of the ways you've experienced being silenced? And we've started to talk about this. Phyllis said it's ignored until a man said it. What are some other ways that people are silenced? Men, women, children, it doesn't matter. How are we silenced?
I think one way for those of us who were sexually abused is fear. There's fear that no one will support us, that we will end up paying the penalty.
Yes.
And that often is the case.
Yes, yeah, we got a long way to go on that. Other ways that we are silenced.
You know, a few years ago, I met a man from Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was a clinical psychologist. And at 35 years of age, he decided he was going to join the police department in Albuquerque. And he did. And he developed a program called Verbal Judo. And he himself was a third-degree black belt. I mean, he was a tough guy, But in that conference, I learned, and I think several other people learned, that you can utilize a person's negativity against them. And that's what happens in martial arts, No matter how big the guy is or how tough he thinks he is, you use that against him and you defeat him. So you can apply that in your everyday life.
You can deflect it or reverse the energy.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Good.
because one great absence from interacting with people is the 3 C's, and that's communication, communication, communication.
Yeah, good. I love it. Other comments? Anything else that came up in the conversation that you want to bring forward?
sometimes people self-censor. They don't get heard because they're afraid from the get-go that they're gonna be made fun of or put down for the opinion. So I think that happens a lot too.
Go ahead.
I think sometimes the not being heard is institutionalized as well. Very often, you heard it there. My experience that was very emotional for me as just an observer was to see it in a school setting where a group of teachers and other specialists are making judgment related to a student and not hearing at all what the student has to say, just continuing to go on and on with their narrative. was shocking to me as a former educator. And to see it institutionalized in an institution that we think of so differently. I think that's the thing that was shocking to me.
So what you're raising there is another one of the ways that we silence people, is that we band together and have groups of power that then can silence another part of the organization. So, and that's what you're describing, that we find people that align with us, and then we feel good because we can, it's all about being able to control the situation. You know, it's all if I ran the world, everything would be fine, which I run into for myself personally all the time. There's an experiment in psychology, and that's my background. There's an experiment in psychology that results in a concept called learned helplessness. And some of that, I think, is at the very heart of what we're talking about when we're talking about this attitude of my voice doesn't count, my vote doesn't count. So the idea is that you put rats in a maze, and I know people are not rats, but bear with me. And you put them in a cage, and you electrify the floor, and you shock them. And there is nothing they can do. There's a bunch of levers, there's a bunch of doors, they can't open the doors, the levers don't work, nothing happens, and they just submit. And then you put them in another cage that looks the same, but all of the doors and all of the levers open and allow them to escape, and they never touch them. They have learned that there is nothing they can do. And when I read some of the accounts of why people don't vote, that's what that sounds like. It sounds like learned helplessness, that there's nothing I can do. So we're gonna shift gears here a little bit, and we're gonna start talking about why it's so important to take action. And then at the end, we are actually going to ask you to commit to taking action. I'm pretty sure everybody in this room is planning on voting. I just get that feeling. So I'm not worried about the people in this room, but I am worried about my niece and nephew. I'm worried about the people out there, the students that we talked to last week at Cal State Long Beach. You know, there's a lot of people who are not voting. And so what can we do to help form a community that offsets some of this power structure, that offsets some of this learned helplessness? And we'll talk about that. But in the meantime, we're gonna have Kim share with us some reasons why one vote matters. Next slide.
Okay, so what you're looking at here is historic voter turnout rates, and these are based on voting eligible population, which of course has changed over our 250-year history. And then obviously the data used to calculate these voter turnout rates back in the early 1800s, we don't know quite how accurate it is, but especially, you know, when there's a whole class of disenfranchised people you're having to estimate. But early in the country's history, the franchise was limited mostly, and there were exceptions though to white male property owners. And the Constitution really didn't have anything to say about who was eligible to vote. Our founding fathers left that up to the individual states to figure that out. By 1856, the franchise in the US had been expanded in every state to include all white men regardless of their property ownership. And you'll notice that as rates rise here and they peak out, that peak is right at the end of Reconstruction. So you start to have a lot of voter suppression among African Americans, and it declines and declines up until, steadies out a little bit, to 1965 when we passed the
Civil Rights Act.
Civil Rights Act, yes, thank
What
you.
are the, I can't distinguish, which is the dark line?
Oh, okay, so this is the dark line, this is presidential term?
Presidential.
Yeah, and this is.
And it's the other way around.
Okay.
Okay.
The
Yes,
dark line is
presidential
midterm.
and midterms, okay?
Dark line is midterms, light line is presidential.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
So, obviously Jim Crow played a big role in suppressing the African American turnout, but this huge run-up in participation had to do with the structure of political parties. So back in the 1800s, we had a really vibrant party structure. There were a lot of different political parties, and they were very local in their actions, right? So a machine in a particular precinct or city, they were paying for funerals, they were helping people get jobs, they were helping people out of work. Obviously, there's a lot of room for corruption there because you end up kind of paying for votes, but it did encourage a lot of people to participate. And then as the 1900s to the 1940s, that whole party power structure started to break down. And so that also contributed to declining voter participation rates. But if you look back where we were at the height at 82.6 of eligible voters turning out, dropping all the way down to, the latest here is 2014, 60% in the presidential, 36.7 in a midterm. Pretty abysmal rates.
Hey, Kim, what happened in 1822 in the presidential election?
You know, I don't know. It could have been just a really terrible candidate. I don't know who was.
Was that Civil
It is,
War?
but you
No?
can't- No, Civil
No.
War is right here.
Okay.
Where we're talking now. And again, some of that might just be statistical because we don't
Yeah.
have good records
We don't
from
have good records.
that.
Okay, just wondering.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so I found this quote, it says, "I believe that voting is the first act of building a community as well as building a country." I debated on whether to use it because unfortunately it was by a congressman who was later, had to quit because of a Senate ethics investigation. But that was still a really good quote, so I left it up there. Because most of us think of voting as an individual act, and of course it is, but it's also something we do as a community. When we want things to change and we finally get angry enough to speak up about it, we become visible in expressing that to like-minded people, and that energy becomes communicative. And then individuals, when they start to speak up, they find each other. And in finding each other, they become a coalition. And it is in that joining together that people start to achieve political power. And they're able to make the changes that they want to see in their communities, and then they get out and vote. Rallies, marches, you know, retweeting different stories and things, getting in your representative's face. I mean, those are all necessary, but they're not sufficient when it comes to actually making change. That is only done through the vote. So if you don't vote, you are sidelining yourself. And of course, elected officials, if they don't have to worry about your vote, they are not going to address your concerns, and you won't be heard. Next. Okay, so if you think your vote doesn't matter, I'm going to show you some examples of when it did matter in our history. So in 1960, the presidential race between Kennedy and Nixon, closest presidential election in U.S. histories in terms of the popular vote and the Electoral College. Kennedy won that race by 0.1%. Right? Obviously, that's more in a presidential election than one vote, but 0.1% is a very close margin. And then in 2000, we had the race between Al Gore and George Bush. That was decided by just a few hundred votes. Well, eventually it went to the Supreme Court, but the difference there was only 537 votes out of millions in that one in Florida, in one state. And then I just broke all the PowerPoint presentation rules by putting a table up there, way too much information on it. But these are the 10 closest House elections in 2016. Now, as I mentioned, the odds of a federal election being decided by one vote are about 1 in 10 million. However, the fewer votes that are cast in an election, the higher the chances of a tie. So while it's unlikely that any of the midterm elections we have coming up will come down to one vote, there's a number of congressional races that we're likely to see very, very small margins of victories. So it really is going to matter who goes out and vote. You can see in 2016, Darrell Issa in California's 49th, he won that by just 0.52%. Okay, that was his margin of victory, and so on down from there. Next. Okay, now here's some really tight examples. So in 1839, Democrat Marcus Landslide, very ironic, I don't know how I came across that nickname. He won the 1839 Massachusetts gubernatorial election by just one vote. And then in 1920, Democrat Charles Smith, he snuck by incumbent DeAlva Alexander by a single vote. And then in 1974, the closest race for a seat in the U.S. Senate occurred in New Hampshire. The initial count had the Republican candidate beating the Democratic candidate by 355 votes. Then Durkin requested a recount, which actually declared him the winner by just 10 votes. And then they had another recount, which handed the victory back to his competitor by a two-vote margin. And then the Senate deliberated and ultimately refused the seat to Wyman, and then they held a special election in 1975, so we're like a year into this, and then he won by 27,000 votes. So there was a lot of back and forth in that particular one. Okay, and there was the time when one vote really did have large consequences, and that was after Congress approved the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. That came down to one vote in the Tennessee Senate, and I think he got a note from his mother right when he was coming down to the vote and urging him to vote for it, and he did, and his one vote decided the passage of the 19th Amendment.
There were no other states that could have voted to change the outcome, so his vote mattered.
Wow.
Okay, next. Okay. Now there's a variety of ways in which tied elections can be settled, and I thought this was fun, so I pulled up some examples. You know, some lead to a runoff or a special election. Some are decided by a third party, such as a legislature or a high-ranking official. We've also seen elections settled by some less conventional means. In one case in Crawfordsville, Indiana, in 1891, the election outcome was settled by a 200-yard foot race. In that case, William Sims, the candidate, seemed to be cruising to an easy victory for county treasurer when he tripped and fell 13 yards from the finish line. And his opponent beat him. That's how they ended up with their state treasurer. In a 1994 Wyoming's House of Representatives race, Republican Randall Luthie and Independent Larry Call each finished with 1,941 votes. The governor decided that race by pulling ping pong balls out of a cowboy hat, being Wyoming, of course. And then in Nevada, this is going to be very obviously how they decided in a very gentlemanly way, by drawing playing cards, with the high card taking home election spoils. So in 2002, Republican Dee Honeycutt came up short, drawing a jack of diamonds to Democrat Gillum's jack of spades for a seat in the Esmeralda County Commission. Card justice was again deployed in 2011 when Tanya Flanagan and Linda Meisenheimer tied in a North Las Vegas City Council primary. Okay, neither candidate wanted to pony up the $600 to pay for a recount, so they ended up drawing cards. Meisenheimer drew a king to Flanagan's 5, but she ended up losing in the election anyway, and so that was $600 not spent and well spent. So, I mean, you can kind of imagine back in cowboy frontier days, drawing names out of a hat, doing a foot race, but all the way up to 2011, drawing cards. I mean, that's pretty amazing to me. Okay. Next. So I thought this was a really interesting statistic I pulled from a report, and this was a study that was done of elections between 1898 and 1992. And what they found was that one of every 100,000 votes cast in U.S. elections and one of every 15,000 cast in state elections mattered in the sense that they were cast for a candidate that officially tied or won by one vote.
Wow.
So this happens a lot more than we think, okay? So that is why your vote counts. Some examples that have happened in just the past year, we saw the Alabama Senate seat, which was Roy Moore versus Doug Jones. That margin was 1.5%. Ohio's 12th congressional district, Danny O'Connor versus Troy Balderson, 0.8%. Virginia House of Delegates, you guys might remember this one, where first Shelley Simons, the Democrat, thought she had won the race by one vote. Then a ballot that election officials had thrown out was judged by their Supreme Court to be valid, but it went to her opponent, which ended up in a tie, and then they ended up doing something that resulted pretty much like pulling a name from a hat to that victory. So these things they're happening every election cycle. Okay? So again, if you don't think your vote doesn't count, here are some things that we might not have if people didn't go out and vote. Next. So we have women's rights. There might be no public schools, a 40-hour work week, our Civil Rights Act, Social Security, Medicare, food assistance, minimum wages, workers' compensation, environmental laws, safe abortions, and various consumer protection laws. So if voting didn't change anything, you have to ask yourself, where would we be? So, voting is the bare minimum.
Yeah, let's hang on to this, cause I want them, let's put this up just before they commit. What do you think?
Oh, okay, we can wait on this one.
I was just thinking that would be a great way to kick off that part on commitment.
Okay, go one slide forward then. So, there's this concept that not voting is a protest. It's not a protest, because you're effectively silencing yourself. You are not letting yourself be heard. So, voting's not a protest, it's a surrender. And we'll leave it at that and move on to the next one.
Yeah, we have a speaker planned for this meeting.
Yes.
And I'm going to give no information about the speaker, except that I think you would have found this person to be interesting and credible and well qualified. But she is in front of a classroom, and she made a comment in that classroom at a university level, and was hauled up by a student who challenged her right to say that in a classroom. And the whole thing got so stressful that she ended up asking to take a leave of absence for a couple of weeks to let everything settle down, and she has to be excused from doing this. So if people are being silenced, there's a lot of different ways, and it's happening in a lot of different places. And I just found it astonishing that it happened to the speaker we had planned for this meeting. So we're gonna move on without our speaker. So one of the things that we wanna talk about is that this idea of building community in order to be able to feel like we have the power and our vote counts and we're motivated to actually vote. I had an experience years ago. I was at a conference, and it was the social hour at the conference, so it was a bunch of strangers sitting at a table. And we talked about this, how voting is part of a community act. It is not an individual act. This man was from South Africa. He was white, and he talked about the day that his village voted after the end of apartheid. And he told the story, it's 20 years ago now or whatever, it's been a long time since apartheid ended in South Africa. But he told the story from beginning to end, from sunrise, where the whole village was awake and up and moving around and on the road to the polling place. And black and white, man and woman, everybody was standing together, and they waited for 8 hours in the sun to vote. And he described the whole process, that everybody at the table had that same reaction. It was an electrifying experience for him. He had never felt closer to the people in his village as he did when he stood in line that day to vote. And it was a source of enormous pride in his country that that could happen and that he witnessed it happening. And the people at the table, I felt as much a part of that experience as he did, because he told the story and pulled us all into a community of people who ended up sharing that experience. So what we want to do is talk about ways that we can build community. Is this when we talk about the videotape?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So what we want to do is build a videotape today, and it's just real simple. You'll sign a release, and you'll hold up a sign that says, "Your vote matters," and we will film you saying that. And however many of you are willing to participate to do that, they're all going to be on the website. We won't identify you, it's just your face and that sign. So if you're willing to do it, there are some releases that we'll have you sign, and we'll pass those around. So we'd like you to stick around and do that if this is something that's meaningful to you. We want our website to reflect the diversity I see in the room and the participation, but I also want it to reflect the enthusiasm that we have for voting and maybe help build some of that community. What we're trying to do is build that sense. You're not alone, your vote matters, here's a group of people who believe that. And we have the raffle at the end.
Yes.
So now it's time for what you're willing to commit to. So what will you do? We are asking that, having been here and sat in a nice comfortable chair and had a free cup of coffee, that as a result of having attended, that you will pick one thing that Kim will put up on her list of things that you can do about how to be heard, and commit to taking an action before the election. So we got a little more than 2 weeks, about 16 days. What are you going to do to take action to help people feel like their vote will count? So Kim, do you want to put up that list?
Yeah, the back one.
Cut back,
Back.
go back a couple.
Back.
Back.
Oh, use the arrow?
Yes.
There are 4 or 5 of us in this room who have been talking to groups at their invitation, describing and explaining the 11 and 5, the 16 ballot measures that are
17. 'cause of counting.
17, okay. I don't have to be able to add. And it's, I have 2 thoughts. One, it's very exciting to see, as we did the other night, over 100, maybe 150 people in this room cramming in to hear us describe each of these ballot measures, and you feel like you really are doing something. People came, they weren't there because they had to get a grade, or they were there voluntarily.
Court ordered them.
Yeah, right. And so that's, I think, one of the best things the league does. We're out in the community, people learn about it, but we're doing something for the community that nobody else is doing. And the point is that we hope we're giving people enough information so that they can make their own decision despite all the pummeling they're getting from ads on television and coming through the mail and everything else. And you should be able to then say, no, but I know that that's not true, or that is true, or whatever. And my other thought is, I looked at your charts, presidential, midterm, local. Where's the local? And it drives me nuts because your voice is so much stronger in the local election where there are fewer people voting.
Exactly.
Because there's fewer people in the pool. And that's where you get 17%, maybe 20% of the vote, where people have the greatest influence at the local level. And somehow it doesn't seem important to them. And that's, it seems to me, the most important, because it's the things that affect you every single day.
Right, it's your schools, your roads,
Yeah.
all of that.
Yeah, and there's a saying that all politics is local.
Yeah,
You know,
well,
so, and that's true.
Look at our congressman. He was a professor of psychology at Cal State Long Beach, and he got involved in local issues, and he was on the city council, and then he was on the state legislature, and now he's doing a great, he's, League of Women Voters. He's working for the community at the congressional level.
Right.
Yeah, I know, Lisa and I just did a candidate forum for the Bellflower PTA for school board elections. And there's 2 incumbents and 2 people running against them, and they're just like everyday people, could be your neighbor, decided, hey, I wanna do this, I have something to contribute, I'm gonna run in this election. And that's one of the things I like about doing the ballot measure presentations and candidate forums, because you realize all these people that are getting involved, they're just your neighbors, they're people like all of us, and they're getting up there and making a difference.
So yesterday I got invited, I was bribed with pizza to come over and talk to a group of people about the propositions. And at the end of Proposition 12, they were all like, okay, we're all done. I said, sit down. We have 5 city and 1 county propositions and we're going through them.
I forgot W.
And afterwards, they weren't even gonna look at the city proposition. They weren't even gonna look at it. And I said, this is the one that's really important,
Yeah.
You really have to understand what you're voting for here. And please, if you haven't looked up the judges, okay, So if you don't vote for a judge, yes, I confirm that I want this person to serve another term. I'm not all that worried about it. But don't skip a ballot measure. Ask somebody, ask any of us. We've been doing these presentations for weeks and weeks and weeks. Please don't vote on something because you don't understand it. We'd be more than happy to help you understand what the issues are, who's saying what, what the text actually says, that kind of thing.
Right, so if you don't vote, you don't get to write, angry letters to the Grunion about the way things are.
Okay.
So I have another thought too, when you were talking about people who don't vote because they feel like their voice doesn't matter. What I've seen a lot is apathy. They don't think that anyway, if people vote one way or another actually affects them. And I find that a little disconcerting.
I think it goes back to thinking of yourself just as your individual vote as opposed to voting collectively with like-minded people to get something done. I mean, if you are part of a group that wants to back a candidate or a certain piece of legislation, when you're many, then that person has to listen to you. Then the elected official has to listen because you come with a block behind you. And I think it's more important to get out of this sort of individual way of thinking about it and get back to something that, or more community-minded in our approach to participation.
And it's how do you motivate those people? So, for example, one person I was thinking about is a friend of mine that is comfortable. She's going to be retiring in a couple of years. She has a pension. She has a 401k. So really, a lot of stuff that's going on now doesn't affect her. And then another person I was thinking about is my friend's granddaughter who says, none of this really matters to me. It doesn't matter what they say. So how do I get those two different people on the spectrum to actually say, no, this is important, and you need to get out there, and you need to vote, and you need to have,
Well, we just put up an article on our website that I pulled from the Atlantic, and it's entitled, Millennials Get Out and Vote Before the Gerontocracy Kills Us All. It does go through there, because, older people, they're a pretty solid voting bloc, and we're deciding, things that might hurt a younger person as they come up in age in their work life.
And
Certainly will affect
a
them.
thing to note, and I just found out and I didn't realize it, but the millennials are going to outnumber the baby boomers very, very soon, over the next couple years. If the millennials are not actively involved in voting and what's gonna happen to them, guess what? The older people and the group that is less than what the millennials are gonna make the decisions for you. And I don't think you want to do that. You wanna participate. If you've called a congressman or a Senate person as a result of something you were upset about, a lot of people are calling, voicing their opinions, the whole, resist movement. That is, the vote is how you make that call. That's like calling your congressman, saying what you feel should happen and how it affects you. That's what a vote does. It's the same way as calling. If you're gonna call, then you should vote.
Well, the other piece, to directly answer your question, Congress voted on a tax cut. That directly affected every single person who collects a wage in this country. The Congress is voting on things like on environmental regulations. They're voting on all kinds of things that affect our daily lives. And that the thing is, have an opinion on those things and choose to vote in the way that supports your opinion. We were talking to a group of women after one of our pros and cons, and I told them I don't have any problem at all with anything that is decided by 80% of the electorate. If the 80% of the electorate goes out and votes, and this is what's decided, that's how people feel. I can go along with that. But when 30% of the people are driving what's happening, I'm not okay with that, because we're not hearing the voices that really affect it. So I would approach it that way. There's a question behind you, Renee. I'm gonna take that one. Go ahead.
Oh, two things. Number one, for her discussing the younger generation, I have the same problem, two nephews, and they said, well, why should I vote? How about the student loans you're gonna be getting? And the effect that could have if you don't speak up about what's going on, could have an adverse effect on you. The other thing is, you mentioned about well, I took from that. I'm concerned about areas that are predominantly one party against and not the other, where it's such a big party that is running that area that the people who are not a member of that party or who don't think along the same lines, they never really get a say-so. How is that resolved? And did I make that clear?
I would point to Orange County.
Well, I didn't wanna say that,
But it's happening in the reverse in other places.
Yeah.
This is in our backyard.
Right, okay.
Where Orange County has traditionally been very Republican for a
Yes.
very long time, with a few exceptions. And some places have shifted blue, some are purple, and some are still very red. I think we need to stop thinking about politics and voting as it happens in November and then I don't have to think about it for 2 years. Things happen over the long period of time, especially at the local level, that builds to the state level, that builds to the federal level. So if we take a longer perspective, if you're out campaigning for a candidate and you're in the complete opposite political party of that area, at least you have a chance to engage people in conversation with your perspective. It may not change them this time, but they may watch that particular issue and then not be satisfied with the person they elected, and 2 years from now or 4 years from now vote differently. So I think we really have to take a longer view. There was a comment over here, and then I'm gonna go to the back, and then Renee, and then Phyllis.
Do you have another presentation about the ballots? Because you said that you had spoken, is there another one?
Last week,
I think
here
we're
last
done.
week.
Yeah, I think we're done.
Or a couple
I have
weeks ago.
one more.
We have one.
Do you?
On Tuesday, at 11 in Bixby Knolls, these are a group of seniors, but I'm sure they would welcome, it's a big room. They'd welcome anybody who wants
At the
to come.
towers?
Yeah.
It's,
No,
the,
no, not at the towers, at the Expo Center.
you know, at the
Okay.
expo,
On Atlantic.
yeah.
Where?
11 o'clock, at the
Yeah.
Expo Center,
Art Expo.
the Art
It's
Expo
on
Center.
Atlantic, on the west side of the street, north of Carson.
Right before
And
San
it
Antonio.
used to be a big furniture store, but it's now, it's got interesting murals on the outside.
11 o'clock on Tuesday.
Is it Tuesday at 11? And you'd be more than
Good,
welcome.
because I live in Bixby Knolls and
Oh, well, come.
the thing, and along with that, when you're doing these things, why are you not sending out notices to us on our email so that we can make
We are.
bulletins or talk to people and encourage them to attend?
Okay.
Because that's the story I get is, I don't understand the proposition, so there's no sense by going.
So we did have a open to the public here, and it was standing room only, it was 2 weeks ago. Some of the groups that we present to are private groups, so we are not allowed to invite the public to those. It's Seroptimus, or the American AAUW, or the Hadassah at the Jewish Community Center, or, you know, it's a private group. So we can't say, come on, come all, because they're serving refreshments, and, you know,
Well,
we
it's
don't
their
get to invite,
membership
it's their
anyway,
membership,
their
and it's
membership.
a private thing for them. We do advertise the ones that are open to the public, but we tend to do it on websites and email now, not in terms of postage, because A, it's very expensive, and B, email is very convenient for everybody who actually uses email, and we know that not everybody does.
So our website has all of the events that are coming up, dates, times, information about them. We also have our next event in a little poster right there. But please, I'll get you our website, and it's very easy to navigate even on your phone, and you can just go to the schedule of events, and it'll be
But
all
in answer to
there.
your question, the one ballot presentation that's left is the one that Renee is doing. We're really, people are sending in their ballots right now, so it's kinda late in the time.
Notice on
Yeah, it's kinda late notice. Zeta, and then Renee, and then Phyllis, and then we'll get to you.
What about me? I have
Oh,
my-
yeah.
I'm sorry, not Zeta, Jane, sorry. Barbara, oh, yeah. 67, sorry, don't remember names anymore. Go ahead. Barbara.
The discussion kind of got beyond what I wanted to say about what keeps people from voting, but I know that it was difficult for many of us who heard in the last presidential election that the popular vote did not elect President Trump. it was the electoral vote, it was very, discouraging for us because of the structure, this old structure that we have, so I just wanted to share that.
Good point.
Your comment is valid. At the same time, no matter which party is in office, they refuse to take down the electoral college. So.
I just had that to say, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, the electoral college could be taken down by any administration, and it never does. So we're stuck with it until somebody takes it down. Renee?
But the point is, though, that I'm saying,
Yeah.
the question was, what makes people maybe not vote? There may be very valid answers to it, but that is a very, very important reason some people don't vote.
Yep, some people really object to it. Renee?
I was watching, NPR television, PBS last night, and they were discussing, that a critical issue among the populace right now is healthcare. And one of the points that these journalists raised was that it was only one vote, Mr. McCain's vote, that has retained the Affordable Care Act.
22 million people.
But had he not, his one vote, were it not for that, there would not even be an Affordable Care Act to be talking about. These millions of people would have no health insurance at all. And so I was impressed that these were well-regarded Washington-based journalists, and they were saying, listen, that one vote has made the difference for the entire United States, that one person. So it really gives you a sense of awe
Your
of
vote does
what
count.
one vote can do.
Phyllis, and then, I forgot your name. Joe.
Oh, I'm just gonna make a quick comment. You mentioned Orange County. What really makes a difference is demographics. You know, no county or any voting block is gonna stay the same. You got younger people coming in, you have people new to the country, new to the state, new citizens, and suddenly demographics can change, and there you go.
Joe?
First, just a correction on the electoral college. It's part of Article 2 in the Constitution, so an administration can change it. What would happen is it would have to take a vote of Congress,
Right,
and then
right.
it would go to three-fourths of the state would have to approve it. And the small states will never get rid of it because it favors them.
But we never even get that far,
Right.
is my point. We
Right.
never even get that
Right.
far. Nobody ever even
So
tries.
that's why we're gonna have that forever. So,
Yeah.
but the other thing I wanted to mention, you were asking about 1822, and that was the era of good feelings, where the Federalist Party had disappeared. So we really only had one party. That was the Democratic
Oh.
Republicans. And the problem is, when we only have one party, people tend not to be heard
That's
because it's
right.
a, and that's the same.
Thank you for that. That was great. That's great information. I
mean, it's
appreciate
easy,
that.
But just to go along with that, that's the problem that we have in California, in Los Angeles County, and in Long Beach, is we basically are dominated by one party. And it's the same thing in states that are red. They're dominated by one party, they have less people voting, because there isn't that competition of ideas.
I was looking at, something in this article here, and it says that, unlike in the 19th century, voter turnout is now highly correlated with class. More than 80% of Americans with college degrees vote, compared to about 40% of Americans with high school degrees. So there's getting to be, a class distinction too in who is choosing to participate, which is obviously going to influence, who gets heard.
It's sort of a different interpretation of an educated voter. I mean, literally, these are educated voters, where when we say that, we mean a voter who knows what the issues are.
Okay, I wanna move on to the commitment, and then I wanna open it up for free conversation afterwards. We'll be doing the filming in one quarter, because I think a conversation is really interesting, but let's get a commitment from each of you before we do that, before people start running out the door.
Okay, so I actually pulled this from Glamour magazine.
Glamour! Glamour magazine, folks!
Well, they did interview a National League member so some of the things you can do, whether you've got, 5 minutes a day or 5 hours or whatever to give. So, the first thing you can do is talk to your family and friends about your voting plans, because they've actually researched this, and if you have a plan in place, you're actually more likely to go out and vote. Post on social media, you can retweet things, talk about candidates or ballot measures that you favor, or you can just make a donation to a candidate or an organization. You've got 30 minutes to an hour. You can volunteer for a campaign. There's always something happening that candidates need help with, whether it's going door to door talking to voters or just dropping off food for the volunteers and staffers. Volunteers can also phone bank. You can also volunteer with a political organization as opposed to a candidate. So if there's not a campaign in your area that you're interested in, you can also find a local chapter of the League of Women Voters or some other organization that helps register voters, host debates, and does voter registration. And then you can get involved with politics beyond, the midterms as they're coming up. It's easy to know about national and state elections, but organizations like Emily's List encourages women to focus locally by attending city council meetings and paying attention to off-year elections. If you've got a little bit more time, you can become a leader on a campaign. Once you find something you really care about, it's easy to carve out some time in what you would normally think is a pretty packed schedule to find time to do this. And then if you've got a day, you can become a poll worker. Phyllis is going to be a poll worker on November 6th, and I sent out a invitation. The county registrar is asking people to come and take a training class to be an observer at the polls. So we have some of our members are going to take part and do that as well. So there's a lot of different things you can do. Voting is the bare minimum, and really voting in this country does not come at a very high cost, right? We're not in Afghanistan where you have to worry about getting blown up when you go out and vote. And people turn up and vote there in spite of that, right? All we gotta do is fill out a form, stick a stamp on it, mail it in. We don't even have to leave the house to.
Doesn't require a stamp this year.
That's right, it didn't require a stamp, so. Anyway, so those are some of the other things you can do in addition to voting.
And I would add to that, if there's something that you're passionate about, healthcare, the conditions in senior centers, young people on campus not being aware, you can just get involved in that. And the league has lots of opportunities for that, so I'll just throw that out there, but you can do that independently of any other organization. What we are asking is that you pick something right now, commit to it, and turn to your partner and tell them what you're committing to. 5 minutes.